Well, thanks everybody for tuning back in to the InterDrone Podcast. We are joined today with Patrick Sherman. He is the founder of the Roswell Flight Test Crew. And Patrick, you've been in the space, as we kind of spoke about at the beginning of this recording, for, I guess, over 10 years now, which is pretty incredible. I think a lot of people may not even be aware that there was a drone industry 10 years ago. But can you just talk a little bit more about your career progression, kind of how you started in drones, and I guess how your career has really evolved over the past 10 or so years?
Sure. Well, I'd say 10 years ago, it wasn't so much an industry as it was maybe a movement or a group of crazy people who found themselves enthralled by the same technology. That's a great question. I became involved. Well, let me take a step back. Essentially, I've spent my whole career as some form of a journalist or a public information professional, marketing communications person. So my whole life has really been about communications. And 10 years ago, I was a journalist, a newspaper journalist, and I was on the public safety beat. So I spent a lot of time with firefighters and law enforcement officers, and so sort of came to understand their problems and their issues and whatnot. And a friend of mine came to me and said, hey, in Europe, they're putting video cameras on the noses of radio-controlled airplanes and sending that video back live. Wow, that's really cool. So in any event, so I was just fascinated with the technology. I mean, just as a technical geek, so there's that. But then, about 5 minutes after he told me that, I started thinking, gosh, wouldn't this be a great benefit to the public safety community? A police officer could look around behind a building before committing himself to going in there, or a firefighter, she could use that to, survey the site. And when you learn about what standard practice is, I'll give you an example. When a fire engine rolls up on a scene, the company officer jumps out of the truck, the other firefighters start pulling hoses and whatnot. Before they try and get people out of the building, before they start spraying water, before they do anything, the company officer walks all the way around the whole building just to make sure they understand the situation. That takes, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 minutes. How much house is burned in that time? How many victims are potentially in trouble? So if you could deliver at a level of situational awareness that is better than that in less time than that, that's a big deal for, firefighters. And so I thought, these drones, these, FPV, first person view systems, could just be a huge benefit for that. So we started tinkering around and building some initial aircraft. And I just cannot overemphasize what a painful trial and error process that was. I mean, people who've taken up drones in the next few years are used to, completely reliable return to home, stone steady, stabilization, etc. It was not like that. So, to make that true. As a matter of fact, the Roswell Flight Test Crew here, our motto, Semper Cadentis, means always crashing, which was a sort of a nod to those early days, because it was just nonstop. But so in any event, so we were doing this mostly for our own enjoyment, and I suppose because we were out in public doing it, people started asking us more and more questions. And so my sort of lifelong, aspect as a communicator, I thought, well, we should make up a website and start putting this information online. And pretty soon that turned into a YouTube channel. And so that's really how it all started, was just discovering this amazing, neat technology and then, sharing it with people. And that led to some, opportunities along the way, which of course led to further opportunities. We started working with FLIR, the thermal imaging camera maker, to put, we made our first flight with a FLIR in 2012. If that puts it in a perspective, which is several years before FLIRs were integrated into DJI's products. So that's it. But I really, throughout it, I see myself sort of as a commentator, a critic, an educator, a journalist in this field, almost more so than a participant as a pilot. I mean, I love flying. I do it frequently. I've gotten to do some really interesting missions over the years, and I'm incredibly grateful for those opportunities. But I guess I think that my sort of my biggest contribution is to helping people understand the industry, think about the issues that are involved in it in a sort of serious and substantial way. And that's so I think that's what it's been all about. And I've been
Yeah.
hugely blessed in that continuing, because I was recently brought on board by Embry-Riddle's Worldwide Department of Flight as an adjunct instructor, and that's been an amazing, opportunity, and opportunity to learn from other people who think like I do about drones. So
Right.
anyway.
Yeah, well, and we absolutely thank you for, just as an industry, thank you for sharing all that information. Information is so is just paramount to emerging industries, emerging technology. Especially in industries where we're a little bit waiting sometimes a stronger regulatory framework. So, just getting out that information out there is progressing the industry as a whole substantially. You mentioned a couple just a second ago that you've done some really cool missions. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about if there's any particular missions which stood out from in your memory, in your career, any kind of really fascinating UAS success stories or use cases that you've been able to do.
Sure. I think probably the most compelling stories I think of come from those early days of like 2010 to maybe 2013. And I'll give you a few specific examples. Because of my background as a journalist working alongside public safety, I sort of knew journalists, and you're a journalist, sort of
Yeah.
have this way of sort of infiltrating things. We know how to get inside organizations and talk to people. And so I had all those sort of journalism skills. And so, whereas I think a lot of our contemporaries at the time, that 2010 to 2013, were building this technology and flying it, and also doing a lot of great sharing of what they were learning on the internet, what I think set us apart was that we went out to document not just the use of the aircraft, but the aircraft's operation in environments where other people hadn't thought about it yet. So, for example, the first video ever on our YouTube channel is us flying drones alongside hot air balloons, in 2011. So, I mean, that was not many people had even thought about that yet, much less done it. And so it was an opportunity, I think, for people to see possibilities, not just see the aircraft fly and have to use their imagination, but to really see it in action.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, with those connections, we were able in 2000, I guess it was probably still 2011, to fly with a group of firefighters doing a big burn to learn, where they burned down this entire apartment complex.
Hmm.
And that video just took off particularly with the fire service
Right.
on the internet, because it was a chance to really glimpse the future. And it's more and more becoming sort of a standard piece of equipment now, but it was really cutting edge stuff back then. And so I think that, again, that began to sort of open up people's eyes to the possibility of this technology.
Right.
And then probably one of the things of which I'm most proud is, I think it must have been 2013, we went out to West Virginia, because we were, a handful of people who sort of could even conceive of, putting a thermal imaging camera on a 2-pound drone. And they were having some significant problems with environmental degradation and trying to restore native fish habitat. And so the West Virginia University wanted to answer a very basic question, and nobody knew the answer, which is, can a thermal camera detect variations in water temperature? Because if the fish like cold water, much like our salmon here in the Northwest, but all the trees being cut down and all the other environmental damage had raised the water temperature to the point where they could, the fish were in real trouble. And so the scientists and conservationists would go out and they'd install, fixtures, little water breaks, etc., back eddies, to help the fish, to give them a place to, or hopefully they could sort of rest up in cooler water. But they were essentially dropping these things at random. They had no way of knowing, hey, is this part of the river, measurably cooler than that? So they heard about what we were doing with drones and thermal cameras, and they thought, well, could we use a thermal camera to survey the whole river and identify, cold spots, and then focus our restoration efforts where they do the most good? And so they invited us to come out, which we did, and we were able to do it. Ultimately, we sort of had to overcome a few hurdles in the field, but we were able to detect variations in surface water temperature, and that was a great benefit to their program. And I thought, again, happening in 2013, a real testament to what the future of this industry was going to bring. Okay. And also about this time, we sought and got permission to fly over the Grand Coulee Dam in eastern Washington State up here in the Pacific Northwest. And I just called up and eventually got a hold of the public information officer at the dam and said, hey, we'd like to fly our little, helicopters over your dam. Would that be okay? And, she asked some folks and the answer came back yes. And so we did. And we were up at 5 a.m. in the morning to cohere with their flight plan, but we flew over the Grand Coulee Dam. And I think that there's always sort of a wisp of sadness with that project because it was really cool, captured some unprecedented images, but it was also, I could sort of start to feel the frontier closing at that point. The drone industry was growing up, it was maturing, and that's of course a good thing, but sort of the ability to, call somebody up and say, hey, I want to fly a drone at your X was kind of going away. And right. So we've gained a tremendous amount. I would never go back, but in terms of sort of high adventure, the industry has not been quite the same since for the past 7 years or so. And that's a good thing, but sure. I do sometimes miss it.
Sometimes miss the good old days. What industry verticals are you most excited about for UAS use, and where do you think we may see some of the most growth as we progress, the second half of 2020 and then into the next few years?
Well, I think I think when you ask anybody a question like that, you sort of have to take into account two things. What is their perspective on the industry and what are they personally interested in? I remain very devoted to public safety applications. So I say public safety when I get a question like that, because the dynamic, nature of the work they do appeals to me, because it's a place where you can have very concrete examples where you're saving lives, using this technology. So it's, so people can like, oh yeah, I get that. That's immediately clear. Whereas if you increase crop yields by 12%, you may save 100 lives or 1,000 lives by feeding people who would otherwise go hungry, but it's not quite the same. So, sure. So for me personally, I would say, public safety. And the other thing I would say is my perspective on the industry tends to be sort of soda straw-like. It's very narrowly focused. Maybe that's the way everybody's perspective in the industry is. But that said, I guess what I believe is that we're seeing a lot of good use cases and things like mapping and surveying. I think ironically, in many ways for, aircraft, which started out sort of the premise of live dynamic video, seem to be having their greatest impact, flying, sort of a lawnmower style missions in the sky, completely unexciting from a piloting or maneuvering standpoint, but, they generate just reams of incredibly useful data. And so I think that's an area where a lot of people see the value. And so that's where I think we're seeing a lot of development. Yeah. And then alongside that, I heard here at Oregon State University down in Corvallis, they have a very robust drone and robotics program. And a member of that program said to me, and this is something that's going to stick with me forever. He said, our scientists tell us drones are the new microscope. It's a new way, a new fundamental way of looking at the world and categorizing it and analyzing it in a way that just wasn't possible before at the level of detail, the level of resolution. And so I think scientific discovery is going to be a really key contribution. I mean, nobody makes a lot of money on the front end of scientific discovery, but it does have the ability to help us better care for our environment, solve real world problems. So I guess those are the things I'm seeing is mapping and surveying, and then mapping and surveying specifically in the service of science.
Yeah, I think that kind of comparison to microscopes is really interesting, just allowing us to look at things from a new perspective. Yeah, right. How have you seen the current pandemic affect the industry? We've seen maybe some companies are less likely to invest money in some startups. A lot of drone companies are more or less startups or early stage companies who don't have a long runway with regards to cash, or maybe they're not profitable right now. Then again, we saw BVLOS waiver early this year for inspection. Here in the United States, we've seen drone deliveries start to happen a little bit more. I mean, what are some of your high-level thoughts on how the pandemic has really affected UAS?
Well, actually, I think you just gave the sort of summary you gave sort of lines up with what I'm seeing. Is it like restaurants, like barber shops, like ballet companies, like so many different sorts of organizations, the advent of the coronavirus and its continued spread has really slammed the brakes on all economic activity. And based on what I've seen, that certainly applies to most drone operations. I mean, and even just most companies working on drones, because it's if you're trying to build drones, like you say, I know a lot of people in this industry sort of go from one drone sale to the next, or one project to the next. And so when the people with the real money, the clients, turn off the spigots, that's a real problem. And then likewise for hardware manufacturers, drones are, at least I don't believe drones are yet seen as sort of business essentials. Companies are figuring out what they're good for, and they are using them more and more, and I don't doubt in the long term that will continue. But when your stock price just hit a brick wall, and you have to lay off 1,000 employees, this is not the time most companies are going to think, hey, we should launch this new initiative where we're going to fly little aircraft around our facilities. I just kind of like, let's maybe hold off on that until we're sure that we're not going to end up like Mad Max. And then I think the final thing, and you were exactly right to point this out, is to a certain extent it's catalyzed some use cases of drones for delivery. Outside the United States, we've seen drones used to check the temperature of crowds. I'm not really sure about the efficacy of that one, but the pandemic has created some new opportunities for drones to show their possibilities, and that legitimate crisis, which can tend to move things forward. It's like if the FAA probably wouldn't have approved that BVLOS waiver, last year, but now that we can save lives and cut down the cycle time on getting COVID tests back by 2 days, that becomes a very compelling reason for action. And so I think that's drones are having a bit of a moment here as they show they can help us fight this terrible plague.
Right. And I think, as we spoke a little bit earlier too, drones can have sometimes a stigma, worthy or unworthy of. That's up for debate, but people do have these kind of predisposed notions of what and you said the word earlier, sinister, which I think is a perfect word for it. They're kind of a little, people aren't sure what's going on, they don't know it, and it's new. And so I think, on the other side of this pandemic, we are seeing drones being used in some pretty good lights. So I wonder if that will change the narrative a little bit and kind of public perception as we move forward.
I think so. I hope. Maybe I should say I hope so.
Yeah.
We're dug in pretty deep because of the use of drones overseas, by the military. That the drones are instruments of war. So, I think nobody in the industry sees it that way. But I think in terms of educating the public, we've still got a long ways to go. But hey. Anything that'll help, I'm all for. I'll support it.
We'll take it. Right. So just final question for you, Patrick, and we'll let you go. What, if anything, do you think is holding the industry back? And we ask this question a lot. We get a pretty similar answer a lot of the times. Technology's there, regulation maybe not so much. So if you are going to say some part of regulation is holding the industry back, I mean, what is most important for the U.S., for the FAA to get right in terms of regulation and kind of taking the next step as a sustainable industry?
Sure. Well, I'll jump on the bandwagon and say regulation is holding the drone industry back. And I think that's true. I mean, I think it's very telling that, in 2016, we got Part 107, and there has been sort of no further certification, training. There's been nothing more for drones for 4 years. And I come from the manned side of aviation as well. And, there you can be a private pilot, you can be a sport pilot, you can be an instrument rated pilot, you can be a commercial pilot, you can fly seaplanes. And each of these different functions comes with a new certificate. It says you've been trained. And obviously, just like, getting your private pilot license or your Part 107, you got to go take a test. Unlike 107, you actually have to show you can control the aircraft, all those sorts of good things. And so it seems to me that the FAA is kind of using waivers, like a daylight operations waiver, in lieu of developing additional ratings. I mean, imagine manned aircraft, if you could fly a Cessna 172 and you wanted to fly a Cessna 172 with floats, so a seaplane. Imagine if you had to write a waiver to fly a seaplane. I mean, people just think that was crazy.
Yeah.
So why in 4 years has the FAA not been able to come up with, standardized training and testing protocol that you can, certify you're competent to fly at night, and that can be a rating you can add to your credential. And I mean, actually, it's interesting. I'm working on an article right now. As a matter of fact, when this call ends, I got to jump back on my computer and to start and finish this article about getting your night waiver for rotor drone. And, it's kind of amazing, that this is something that still requires a waiver. And the premise of my article is that everybody can do a waiver, but it's time consuming. It can be difficult. There's a lot of
scalable.
Yeah, it's not simple. And so there's kind of, there's kind of that. And obviously, if we could put into place both the regulatory and technological framework to allow for beyond visual line of sight, for routine operations over people, all the stuff everybody talks about, all that would be true. However, if I may, I think I will add an additional hurdle to your, the regulations are holding us back when it comes to the industry. And I think another thing that's holding us back is sort of a failure to understand sort of the role of drones in the organization and in the society. When I was coming up, and certainly there are tens of thousands others like me, we sort of envisioned something that the drones would turn out something like the rest of the aviation industry, where there would be specialized people whose only job was to operate the aircraft. And so if a corporation or an organization needed aerial video or surveying, they would call, your friendly local drone professional who would come down, do that work for them, give them the end result, and, take the check to the bank and cash it. And I think if the last few years have taught us anything, is that's not the way it's working out. The overwhelming number of people who are relying, or organizations, the overwhelming number of organizations who are relying on drone technology are taking people who are already working for the organization and training them as drone pilots. The possibilities are you can hire me, who's good at drones, but doesn't know a thing about, electrical systems, and I can fly the drone around your power lines, but then I've got to hand that data off to a lineman who actually can understand what's happening there and make the correct decisions. Or you can send the lineman to a week-long course, and they can become a drone pilot, and they can do all their own analysis right on the spot. And I think that's the way the industry has moved. But I think the problem is that I think what people need to understand is that when you become a drone pilot, even if you're full-time, even if it says engineer on your business card or farmer or whatever it says, you are at least part-time an aviator. And I think that a lot of organizations have yet to sort of make that fundamental leap. And frankly, a lot of people who use drones professionally are not yet thinking of themselves as aviators, as part of a separate community from the regular professional community, which has existed for more than 100 years and has its own traditions and ideas and whatnot. And so I think that for the drone industry to succeed in the long term, the people who use drones in organizational settings are going to have to come to appreciate that this is a new community they're joining. It's the aviation community. And so, because until you do that, you're not really going to make good decisions about risk, about safety, about those sorts of things. And so I think that providing that education, which has obviously been my personal goal from day one, is kind of a missing piece in it too. So, one man's opinion.
Yeah. Well, no, I think you make some really good points there. And, we've had that debate back and forth. Is it easier to teach a surveyor how to fly a drone, or is it easier to teach a drone pilot how to survey or map? So, yeah, I think, it's a really interesting debate. But
well, surveying is actually an interesting use case only because in Oregon, at least, this is regulated at the state level, but in Oregon, at least, you have to become a professional surveyor. is not a, not a trivial undertaking at all.
Mm.
There's a lot of education. There's like an internship. There are multiple layers, and it'll take you a week. In a week I could get somebody to pass the 107 test with flying colors, but take 3 years for somebody to teach me to really be a proper surveyor. So
Right.
So I think in Oregon, at least, the people who want to plug drones into surveying are necessarily going to be the ones working with the surveyors.
Sure.
or surveyors themselves.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. Well, Patrick, any final thoughts before we let you go?
Well, just kind of frankly, how much I miss you guys, certainly the InterDrone team with whom I've been associated, since at least 2015, and just more broadly, sort of the drone community. I mean,
Right.
we've all seen, you guys have been postponed till, late in the year, and I really hope we sort of get things under control so that goes off as planned, because I am anxious to get myself to a drone event. And Exponential's also been postponed. Commercial UAV was, shut down entirely as a physical event.
Yep.
And, I miss folks. I think there's a lot of advantages to getting out and meeting with people face to face and talking things through and really understanding what they're doing. And to be sure, things like this podcast help a lot, but it's no substitute for being there. So I'm hoping we come up with a vaccine, or maybe drones can magically sprinkle some mist over us that'll make us immune to the coronavirus or something, because I'm ready to get out there and meet with some folks.
Yeah, I totally hear you. We echo that sentiment as well. It's definitely not the same as meeting up in person, and the conversations aren't quite the same, and you don't get that that same level of information sharing. But we're all doing the best we can, and until we get there, and we appreciate for all the work that you do in the space, and really appreciate you hopping on and joining us today. How can people find out a little bit more about what you do? How can they get a hold of you to ask any follow-up questions, or learn more about the Roswell Flight Test Crew?
Well, I actually let me say one other thing, if I may, but Matt, I will answer your question.
Please.
That is going to say thank you to you and the whole InterDrone crew, because in addition to meeting people in person, which is great, with seeing hardware with your own eyes really helps you understand something in a way I don't think you can get from a photograph or a production video. Being able to pick something up in your hands and hold it, and talk to a knowledgeable person about it, and everything, that's the value you guys deliver with InterDrone. So I think certainly it's the people, but it's also the chance to see the hardware in person. Anyway, should someone want to get in touch with me, probably the easiest way is just to go to roswellflighttestcrew.com, just written out, no special characters or anything. Or for the truly masochistic, you can try to send me an email directly, but my email address is lucidity@roswellflighttestcrew.com. So if you can work out how to spell that, you're welcome to send me an email. But otherwise, just head over to the website. There's a contact us link. Click on it, brings up a text box. Type whatever you want, comes straight to me.
Perfect. Well, great. And we'll put that link in the description below. So thanks again for being here. Thank you to Miriam, who was on earlier, and everybody for tuning in. And we will see everybody next week. So have a great rest of your week.
All right. Take care.
Bye, Patrick.
Bye.